There we go. Okay, I'm sure everybody can see my screen now. So the title of my talk is Using Nature's Way to Fight Climate Change. I want to thank everybody for caring about this issue enough to spend a beautiful sunny day on the Gulf Islands listening to me. This is a fairly long talk, but I don't have to get through the whole thing. If you have questions, I have spots throughout the talk where I'll stop and see if there's any questions. And you know, if I don't get through the whole thing, well, then you can have me back to finish it. So these are the 4 topics I hope to talk about. First, the context. I don't know how much everybody here knows about climate change and just how we manage it internationally. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Then I'll talk about nature-based solutions specifically and the results of a study that I just published. And then I want to talk a little bit about numbers, because I think the numbers around this climate change issue are very confusing. There's different numbers coming up. And I think you have to, it's like all information, we have to get better educated at questioning what's up and what's out there. And the last thing I want to talk about, which I might not get time to, is carbon offsets, because that relates to nature-based solutions. And there's a lot of activity in this area, and I know everybody's interested in it. If I don't get to talk about that, I might suggest maybe in the future we can have a panel discussion on something like carbon offsets specifically. So first, the context. I'm sure you've all heard about the Paris Agreement. You know that everybody, all countries in the world, including the US, have signed on to this agreement and agreed to keep global warming below 2 degrees above industrial levels and to pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees. Where we're at now is we're just about at an average temperature of 1 degree. If nothing had happened, there'd be no Paris Agreement. We'd be at 4.2 degrees. If we look at all the commitments so far, that will take us to 3.3 degrees. And so we have a long way to go to get to 1.5 degrees. The Paris Agreement is a very unique agreement. How it works is that every country puts in their nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement. That is their commitment of what they're going to do to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And every 5 years, each country is supposed to ratchet up their commitments, ratchet up their goals, so that we can finally reach the target. And so Canada's done this too. We have a nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement. Many of you know this. We have a target. This graph shows you Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, and it's in millions of tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. So the black line is business as usual. Starting in 2005, I started there because that's when our target starts. And our current target is to reduce it to 30% below where we were in 2005. You can see up to, I don't know if can people see my pointer? Probably not. Oh, they can? Yeah, so here's where we are today. And you can see we've really had a little dip around 2010, but basically we haven't done anything since 2005. And our target is here. This is about the latest data, 729 million tons of carbon dioxide that we claim we release into the atmosphere. The target is 30% less than that, 511. Some organizations think our fair share is more like 269. So we should be reducing it not at 30%, but 60% less than what we would have done in actually the global targets measure from 2010. And I'll talk about some nature-based solutions. The first recommendation I have could get us from the current target a long ways to our fair share using nature-based solutions. And you will note that I haven't got any nature-based solutions in this part from the business as usual to the current target, because I think there's general agreement that this part has got to be done by reducing directly fossil fuel emissions. And I'll talk to that a little bit later. So that's where we're at now. And I want to talk to you just really quickly about the carbon cycle, because in my experience, this is really, we all know about it. We know that carbon, there's fluxes, carbon moves around, but we don't really understand how it works. So what this diagram shows you over here is the land-based fluxes. And basically, the land base absorbs about 450, now this is gigatons, this is billions of tons of CO2 a year. And remember, we were measuring Canada's emissions in millions of tons, so that's 1,000 times less. So the land-based system absorbs about 450 billion tons, and it releases about 140 billion tons. So it's not like it just sucks up carbon dioxide, it also releases it through respiration. So the difference is about 10 billion tons of CO2 a year is taken up by the land. In the ocean, it's pretty well the same thing. The ocean absorbs about 340 billion tons of CO2 a year and releases about 330 with a 10 billion ton difference. And this number here is how much we're currently releasing globally, almost 52 billion tons of CO2 equivalents a year. The reason I say equivalents is because there's a lot of greenhouse gases other than carbon dioxide that affect climate change. And some of them are even worse at, even worse, have an even bigger impact than carbon dioxide. So when we measure our releases, methane, for example, which is shorter lived in the environment, but has a much bigger impact, is incorporated into this 52 billion tons of CO2, should be say equivalents there. So that's the first part. So you can see that from the land and the water, they absorb about a net of 10 billion tons of CO2 a year extra from what they emit. But here's the big story. The big story is the carbon that's stored in these ecosystems. So at this point, we have about 875 billion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere. And there's general agreement that in order to reach the Paris Agreement targets, we have to actually get rid of some of this. We have to take it out of the atmosphere. If you look at the land base stores huge amounts of carbon. The plants store about 550 billion tons globally, and the soils about 2,300 billion tons. So when we talk about nature-based solutions, we're talking about what's above ground in the plants and what's below ground in the soils, and trying to keep that there. Because as soon as you take this storage and release it, it ends up in the atmosphere. The oceans are even more incredible. The surface of the ocean stores about 1,000 billion tons, but the deep ocean, the ocean floor, stores about 37,000 billion tons of CO2. And this is pretty well locked up there. It gets there in many different ways. And you might have, I don't know if any of you read The Guardian, or probably some of you do, you'll have noted that they've recently showed that some activities like bottom trawling can actually release this deep ocean stored carbon by disturbing the ocean floor back into the atmosphere. So that's the fluxes in a nutshell, and it's a little more complicated, but the short version. Then I put this slide in here. This is really to try and put all these crises into context. I like this cartoon because it was first brought to my attention by a minister in the federal government. And this, she said, made her realize how important biodiversity is compared to everything else. So here we are in the COVID crisis. It is a crisis, and it's affecting all of our lives. Could lead to a recession, huge. But climate change is much bigger than that. So while we're trying to solve these, what seem big, smaller crises superimposed on that is climate change. But the collapse of biodiversity is really sort of the mother of all crises in a certain way, because everything depends on that. Our lifestyle, our economy, everything depends on the natural systems that we we use and enjoy. So you have to think, when you're thinking about nature-based solutions, you're thinking about climate change, but you're also thinking about biodiversity loss, because we can't have solutions that try and solve one crisis and actually negatively impact another one. When we talk about nature-based solutions, we often say nature's the forgotten solution. It's 25% of the problem, 30% of the solution, and 1% of the conversation. And I would say that it's starting to come to the forefront where at least policymakers are starting to understand that nature-based solutions are actually very significant. So when I say 25% of the problem, it's the deforestation of the Amazon, of the tropical forests. It's the destruction of soils, destruction of our own forests, the coastal ecosystems that are so important for storing carbon. All of these systems that are disturbed end up releasing carbon. And part of the problem we have, 25% of the problem, in fact, is because of the destruction of natural ecosystems that have released CO2 into the atmosphere. A paper came out in 2017 that said, it's in the journal PNAS, some of you might know it, that about 37% of the solution could be found in nature. Since then, there's been a lot of other papers showing it's more like 30%, but still, even protected areas, which I'll talk about a bit in my own findings, that of course they're impacted by climate change, but they are also part of the solution. And so you have to think of them that way. And now, even in Canada, where a mere 5 years ago, nobody was talking at the government level about sort of nature-based solutions. Now the government's looking at how to use them. So I'm going to stop there. I noticed that David had his hand up for a question, and just to see if anybody has any questions at this point. Any questions?
I guess I put my hand up so I can talk first here, Risa, and I wanted just to talk to everybody. Please feel free to raise your hand for a question, or if you don't want to ask the question online, please just, you can type it into the chat message and we'll relay it to anybody. So that was my reason for raising my hand there. So I'll pass on the question though this time.
So someone named Kim has raised their hand. Kim?
Yes, I just have a question. When you were talking about the graphs in terms of the climate, the Paris Climate Agreement, I know there's a large amount of emissions from tankers that move between countries, and I know many of those tankers are, under the flags of very, very small countries. Is the emissions from those tankers, are those adequately adjusted for in the Paris Agreement? Are they adequately captured in that? Or are we still missing all that carbon release?
We know that shipping is a big, has a big impact on CO2 emissions. So that is true. Who claims them? I'm not sure I can answer that, but it's a very good question. I hope I'm sure they're incorporated. It's just a matter of which country has to claim them. It's probably the country of origin that claims them, but I'm not 100% sure of that. So that's something I'm going to sort of look up for myself, but it's a good question because it is significant. And it's significant in Canada, and it's significant in British Columbia, shipping and the emissions that come from shipping.
All right, thank you.
Thanks for that question. Really good. Yeah, let's see if I can. Okay, so the next part I'm going to talk about is this report that was released in October 2020 called Enhancing Canada's Climate Change Ambitions with Natural Climate Solutions. So I wrote this report. I got funding for it through something called the Carbon Landscapes Program of the Metcalfe Foundation. And the idea of this report was to provide some recommendations that would influence Canada. I am about to try and publish it in the scientific literature, but I didn't at the time because the more important exercise was to influence government, who doesn't read the scientific literature, but would read a report like this, and did. And that was at the time when budget discussions were happening, as obviously the budget's going to happen. I think it's next week. So we wanted to get natural climate solutions into the budget and have some ways to do it. And that was the purpose of this report. So the next little bit, I'm going to talk about some of the contents of that. So the first thing here is this map. This map shows you just in Canada, above ground forest carbon and below ground carbon. And you can see that the darker it is, the more carbon. So you can see on the top map, you got very dark areas on the west coast of British Columbia, in the interior, and it's still pretty dark. That red is still pretty forest carbon intensive in the whole boreal forest in Ontario and Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador. Then if you look at the below ground carbon, there you see that below ground, places like the Hudson Bay lowlands, these are where the peatlands are, the peat forests are, and these areas are globally significant for carbon storage above and below ground. This next map this shows you the Canada portion of the global map that's in the corner there. And this shows you, this is a paper written by Soto de Vero, and they looked at biodiversity and carbon together. They tried to overlay it, and they had different ways of measuring biodiversity. Oops. In this case, they measured biodiversity as places with unique and intact biodiversity, and carbon density, as you saw before. And on the bottom there, I've tried to circle this globally. So the big global areas for this overlap of biodiversity, high biodiversity, carbon density, is the whole boreal forest in the world, Canada, Alaska, Russia, the Amazon, the Congo Basin, and the Indonesian archipelago. So you might have guessed all that, but when we're thinking globally, the role of Canada, it's preserving these areas with high carbon density and high biodiversity, in this case, unique, irreplaceable, and intact biodiversity. These are the areas that are very important globally, and Canada is one of the countries that is most important. Before you talk about natural climate solutions, in this report, we really thought about some principles that have to be established. And the first principle is natural climate solutions do not replace the imperative to reduce emissions from fossil fuels. So anytime you see a solution that says, well, and this is where you get into, I hope I get to talk a little bit about carbon offsets, a solution that is willing to replace fossil fuel reductions with some restoring a forest, for example, that's not what we call natural climate solutions, because the imperative first is to reduce fossil fuel emissions. The second principle relates to this benefits for both biodiversity and climate change. So there's a bit of a movement. The picture on the left is a building. So the Canadian Forest Service is really promoting this idea that if we use our forests for lumber, that lumber stays in the buildings until those buildings decay. And so it's not released. Of course, that solution, it is true that this lumber, if that building lasts for 80 years, then it will be 80 years before that this carbon in that is released. But just the logging of it and the processing of it releases about 80% of that carbon. So you've got about 20%, it's actually a bit less, stored in the buildings. But the other thing is that if you promote more logging just to put carbon into buildings, you're negatively affecting biodiversity. So that's not a natural climate solution. That is a principle. You have to have an impact on both. And the picture on the right is one of the clear cuts in BC's interior. So just by doing this activity, you're getting a release of carbon. And that it can never be a natural climate solution if you're negatively impacting biodiversity. The third principle relates to permanence. And this has been a big discussion within Canada. You've probably heard about the 2 billion tree program, which I'll talk about a bit later. But it's not enough, if you're really talking about a climate solution, to say, grow a forest or enhance it and then chop it down, because it's not a permanent solution. You're going to release, you may release the carbon 5 years later or 10 years later, but you're still releasing that carbon. A permanent solution has to protect it and keep that carbon above ground, keep it sequestering carbon more over time, and keep all the stored carbon in the ground. The fourth principle has to do with addressing the rights and title of Indigenous peoples. That goes hand in hand with natural climate solutions in Canada and globally. First of all, we can thank the Indigenous people in Canada and the world, because most of the intact systems that are remaining are on Indigenous lands. So you cannot think about natural climate solutions without working with Indigenous communities in Canada and around the world, because they have been the stewards and they've actually created the opportunities. This map shows you all the dark blue layers are intact ecosystems. The light ones are the intact forest layer. So you've got the north that's intact but not forested, and then the intact forest layer. And then the red dots are where Indigenous communities are, and the yellow dots are where this Indigenous Guardians program is. And these are, Canada has been promoting this Indigenous Guardians programs to pay Indigenous people to continue to protect their special and intact ecosystems for biodiversity and for climate change. So this idea of addressing the rights and title of Indigenous people is core to the implementation of any natural climate solutions in Canada and around the world. And then the fifth principle relates to catch and store. So this concept, catching is sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere. Storing is all this carbon that's in the ground. So like on the right, for example, I have a picture of a salt marsh in the Bay of Fundy. So you don't think of this as salt marshes, most of which have been destroyed on all of our, at least our east and west coasts, and we still have some really important ones in the north coast. These are one of the highest areas for carbon storage per hectare in the world. Now the forests are more important just because there's so much more forest, but on a hectare per hectare basis, the coastal ecosystems like eelgrass beds, salt marshes, and then in the more tropical areas, mangroves are really the center of carbon storage. So you have to think about sequestering carbon, but you also have to think about maintaining those stores. And a lot of the solutions that are provided talk just about sequestering carbon and ignore the impact on the stores of industrial activities that release that carbon. This graph just gives you a little sense of how important these systems are. This is global, and it looks at the stored carbon in different systems. So when you look at this, you can see the boreal forests are more important for stored carbon than tropical forests. And the peatlands, of which Canada is world famous, as well as these native grasslands, which we have very little left of, around the world are also real hotspots for carbon storage. So now I'm just going to go into a few of my recommendations, not all of them, and then I'll have another break for questions. So I looked at a lot of data, and I will tell you that doing an exercise like this is very difficult because we don't have a database that really captures all the carbon that's sequestered and stored in Canada's ecosystems. We have a database for managed forests, and it's good, but limited in what they measure. But we have nothing for the unmanaged area, all the peatlands, the grasslands, the coastal ecosystems, completely ignored. So the only way to pull together that data was to read a lot of papers, look in the literature, because there'll be measures here and there from, you know, one part of, say, BC's coastal ecosystems, maybe one forest, a piece of the boreal forest. And so I read 1,200 papers to come up with these conclusions, and I didn't have any conclusion at the beginning what my recommendations would be. I just wanted to see where the data would lead me. And the data led me to the place that what I call targeted protection, protecting the threatened, intact, carbon-dense, high biodiversity ecosystems would be the most effective natural climate solution to 2030 in Canada. I chose to 2030 because, you know, if you read the global literature, you understand that we have all these goals of net zero to 2050, but we have to make significant reductions by 2030, or we've totally lost the ability to even get to 2 degrees. So this targeted protection was my #1 most effective solution. This would sequester over 175 million tons of carbon dioxide per year by 2030. This would increase Canada's ambitions by 34%. So remember, I'm suggesting, I told you at the beginning, that getting to our 511 megatons is that we're not talking nature-based solutions. It's the next part, increasing your ambition. We could increase our ambition by 34% just by protecting our carbon-dense, high biodiversity ecosystems. And that's only on the catch side, the sequester side. On the avoiding emissions from releasing carbons from these threatened ecosystems, we could avoid emissions of, well, about 586 million tons of CO2 equivalent immediately. And we would be measuring that in the billions of tons by 2030. This would increase Canada's ambitions by like over 100%. So it's very, very significant. But I have to say something here, because I read a study, someone alerted me to a study that was done by the Canadian Forest Service in 2018. And they looked at pathways also to increasing Canada's emission. And one of their pathways was to not harvest any forests greater than 250 years. So only, that means to protect all the old growth forests. And they concluded, I show this graph a little bit later, that that would actually, up to 2030, increase Canada's carbon emissions. And that was so counterintuitive. I couldn't figure out how they got there. How they got there was because they assumed that if you protect the old forests, you have to maintain the amount of timber, like the board feet that you harvest. So you have to harvest a huge area of younger forests, because harvesting old growth forests gives you so much more timber per hectare. So that to me is not a natural climate change solution, because you are then impacting biodiversity by more logging. You have to reduce, in order to do this targeted protection, you have to take away the threat, but not increase a threat somewhere else. There's a term for that in this field called leakage. So you don't do an activity somewhere else and then actually increase the activity in a different place. So this targeted protection is pretty big. This graph just shows you one part that I thought would be interesting to British Columbia, and particularly because someone just went off to protest the logging of old growth forests. On the left, you have emissions reductions. This is just by maintaining the stored carbon in BC's primary forests on the high productivity sites that are under imminent threat. So I didn't look at forests that aren't going to be harvested. I only looked at the ones that are going to be harvested. And I also looked at the old boreal forests, because there's a bit of a myth that boreal forests are all young because they all burn down, but that's not true. In Eastern Canada and Central Canada, there's some very old boreal forests, some of them thousands of years old, and they don't burn regularly. The frequency between burning is way over 500 years. It's similar to the coast. So if you look at just, and I only looked at how much is logged each year. So I'm not presuming that it's all under threat. I'm just looking at how much is logged each year. And you can see that we could save, you know, somewhere between 300 and over 500 million tons of CO2 just by not logging the primary forests on the high productivity sites in British Columbia. And so what we're doing trying to save these forests is really very important. The map on the right there just looks at the risk to old forests on productive sites. And, you know, we do have about 23% old forests in British Columbia, but those are all on the tops of mountains, in places with very unproductive land, and they are important ecosystems in their own right, but they're not the big old trees that we think of that are carbon dense and important and so important for biodiversity. Those areas at high risk are the ones that I'm talking about here. So it's, you know, how you look at your data is very important. My second recommendation related to something called proforestation. So that's a new term, but the concept isn't really new. That's a picture in the background of a second growth forest on Galiano Island. I took that picture. We have many of those. In fact, most of our forests look like that. So I looked at, just presume that you were, proforestation means to take the younger forests that you already have and let them grow old. But again, you have to then protect them. So if you let them grow old, there'll never be primary forests again, but they will develop over time some of those old growth characteristics that we've lost in these very young forests. So I presumed, okay, we're not going to ever protect all the forests over 60 years old, but let's say we grow 30% of them to reach their ecological potential, and then protect them, because then just cutting them down doesn't make any sense. You're then losing the carbon again. So just this activity, it would increase the carbon sink by only 1.5 million tons a year. And this is, again, only the parts that are threatened. I didn't count all the forests over 60 years, only the ones that would be about to be harvested. And by 2050, this would increase to about 470 million tons. So it gets significant over time because those forests are growing up. As they grow up, they're sequestering more carbon, and they're becoming more important as a sink. But then when you look at the store part, the catch and store part, that would avoid emissions of about 126 million tons per year right away. And beyond 2050, we're again talking in the billions of tons. What this would also do would be increase the protected areas by 1.4 million kilometers squared. This next slide shows you just a little bit on the impact of protected areas, because Canada has a target not only to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, but we've now signed on to what they call the High Ambition Coalition to protect 25% of our land and waters by 2025 and 30% by 2030. We have about 12.5 protected now. Somebody's in the waiting room, I noticed, whoever lets those people in. So right now we have about 1.2 million hectares protected. By the targeted protection recommendation, we could protect an additional 1.3 million hectares. That would be doubling our current protected area on the land, and that would end up, we'd exceed our 2025 target, and proforestation would be even bigger. But the thing about proforestation, it would be only protecting forests, whereas the targeted protection, we're talking about protecting the high biodiversity, carbon dense ecosystems, including the salt marshes, the eelgrass beds, the grasslands, the peatlands, all those. And again, I'm only talking about what's under threat. So I think I'm going to take another break here, question break, if anybody wants to ask a few questions.
Oh, yeah. Hi.
Hi.
I'm not sure what my comment was, but it was earlier in the thread, and it was in response to your comments, Risa, about Indigenous people as stewards of lands that are both carbon storing and biodiversity rich. And I guess what I was struck by in the maps you shared is how very high latitudes in Canada, boreal and Inuit and Dene territories store a ton of carbon, including below ground. All of which are, or most of which are subject to modern treaties with Indigenous people, but all those landscapes move west into Alaska. And so if you look at US-Canada collaboration on climate and nature-based solutions, Alaska, which is a neighbor of BC, by the way, becomes disproportionately important, not only for all that storage and a huge land base, much of which is federal, but also because it's the most Indigenous proportion of any state in the US, and many of those cultures are contiguous with Canada. And so I was just thinking about the whole top of North America as a globally significant collaborative opportunity for biodiversity, carbon, and people.
Exactly. And letters have already been written to Biden on that very topic. Absolutely. It's a huge opportunity for Canada-US collaboration, especially because there seems to be an interest in our two countries collaborating on the climate file, including on the nature part of that, because both when Trudeau and Biden met, they both, their release said that they were interested in working together on nature and on climate change. So, and nature-based solutions are part of that. So that is true. And also, it can't be understated the importance of the relationship with Indigenous people on this area. And I think that in Canada and the US, I don't know so much about the US, but in Canada, we could be leaders in this if we chose to, because it's all over the world. This is true, where there's so much intact area, like in the Amazon, as a result of Indigenous lands, those people are under attack. The Congo Basin is like a newly discovered peatland, forest peatland. It's amazing what's in there. And of course, it's under threat because people need to survive. And so we need to work with people and find a way for their values to be incorporated. Everybody here knows all this, but what is exciting is how this is recognized across the country in the conservation movement, in the climate change movement, and also globally. Maybe not as much globally as it is starting to be recognized, at least in Canada. So yeah, it's incredibly important and kind of exciting. When I get into, if I get a chance to talk about carbon offsets and how some of the First Nations people in Canada have benefited from that approach, it's pretty interesting.
Risa, there's 3 more questions. Could we start with Tyne?
Sure.
Well, yeah.
Sorry about that.
Oh,
Hi,
hi,
Risa.
Tyne.
Hi, Risa. Tina here. So I have a bit of a geekish question because as an economist, I'm curious about how you factor in the dynamic aspects of ecosystems when you do the calculations of carbon storage, because it's completely dynamic. So when
Yes.
you do your measurements, you know, how do you factor in that type of flexibility, because an ecosystem can look completely different from one year to another?
Well, what I did was I looked at, you know, I think this is actually, I'm trying to answer this in not too technical a way. You and I are having a special meeting, which is going to be great. And I hope we will talk about these really technical issues together. If that, it's not that I want to put your question off. I think it's really important. It's just that I could spend half an hour talking.
Yeah, no, that's okay. That's okay.
So I will really ask, and if other people want me to go into that, maybe I will at the end if we have some time. It's just Tina's right. There's some, you know, really deep questions about measuring and what you account for and what you don't and what you can account for. One thing I will say is that I did discover that there's a lot of variability in the estimates people give, depending on the sites that they're measuring and all kinds of different dynamic questions and the assumptions that they're making in their models. And so when I gave my data, I have a chart in the back of my report that looks at ranges. And sometimes the ranges are huge because different studies come up with different numbers. And I'd like to have better data, but in the face of not having better data, I think the most honest thing to do is show the ranges, the potential, which can be, vary by 100 times or even 1,000 times sometimes.
Great.
Maybe
Thanks.
Susan Hannon could
Okay.
quick question and then one more.
Okay. Susan?
Oh, sorry. So I like your ideas about pro-forestation, but I guess the lumber industry would probably not agree with you because those are stands that if they're prevented from logging old growth, they're going to be depending on for their industry. So where does the logging industry, where can they do their activities, or do you think we should just start phasing in different types of building materials?
So the first thing I'll say is that I don't know if you've been around for a long time like I have. Many years ago, there was a premier who said the forest industry in British Columbia is the sunset industry. And he was creamed for saying that. But what we log in British Columbia is old growth forest. There's only so much of that. That is what we're logging. The secondary forests are much poorer quality, and that's why they want to log the little that we have left of old growth forest, but then we have none left. So however you look at it, it's that part of the industry is dead now or in a few years. In my calculations, I didn't presume that we stop logging in the pro-forestation all the younger forests. I just said all the forests over 60 years. I said 30%, and that's nationwide. And that's because a recognition that we will still have need for lumber products. But I think we do have to scale back our logging. Like, we have to face it, that we have over harvested. And so that industry has to face it. They've over harvested and they'll have to harvest less. And of course, you're already seeing it in the cost of timber. My son's a carpenter. He can't believe the way the cost of timber's gone up. Is that because of COVID and gouging? Is it because there actually is less timber? I don't know the answer to that. But I think that, and this, you get into values, it's a really good question. Like, I don't think that we can, all of our economy, all of our lifestyle, our life depends on biodiversity. And in a country like Canada and a province like British Columbia, that's the forests. And it can't be, we have to scale back. Yeah, I think we do. And that will cost money. Absolutely. It'll make and that industry is already less important than it used to be already, because they've already taken the cheapest, easiest to get, highest carbon density forests. So I know it's not a satisfactory answer, but as an ecologist, I think that it can't always be that the economics dictates the destruction of the environment. That's my answer. Not satisfactory, but it's satisfactory to me.
Totally
agree. This is less important. I'm just gonna do it a little bit faster, if you don't mind. So my third recommendation related to lengthening the harvest rotation. I put this in there because this is actually something that has been proposed by the Canadian Ministers of Forests. And they have an organization, and they thought, well, why don't we lengthen the harvest rotation so that we can have older forests and sequester more carbon? But in the long run, the idea is to harvest those forests, but it would buy us some time to get some other things done by 2030. And so I put that in there. I looked at if it would have an impact, and it would. And again, I thought, let's be reasonable, because, like, as people have brought up, there's an economics. We're not going to stop harvesting. So what if we lengthen the harvest rotation just on 25% of the harvested land base? That will reduce emissions by about 1.2 million tons of CO2 per year for every year of delayed harvest. So that's getting to be significant. That's getting to be about 15 million tons by 2030. So if we did that, and maybe another 10 years, another 30 million tons, we could have a significance, and hopefully then we would have other measures that would take up the slack, because in the long term, we would eventually harvest those forests. So I put that in there to just a thought exercise on that. And then the last thing I put in it, restoration. There's so many possibilities for restoration. I didn't go into detail about all the restoration activities, but there's two things that we're doing in Canada right now. I wanted to know the impact of that. One of this is the planting 2 billion trees, which the government has committed to and they've put money into. And the other one has to do with the restoration of our coastal ecosystems, which is being done for the purposes of climate change adaptation, protecting our systems, protecting our land base from storm surges and things like that. I noticed Anne Erickson's on this call and she knows quite a bit about this. And I wanted to know, but they're not counting the carbon for those exercises, which I actually think they should, but they don't. And I've asked them to, and they think it's a good idea. It's just not in their sort of frame of reference. So I looked at what the impacts of that would be. As the 2 billion trees, 2 billion additional trees. So it has to be additional trees. It can't be trees that we're planting already because we're required to after logging. It can't be anything that's required, because one of the rules of all this kind of work is something called additionality. It has to be in addition to what we've already done or already doing. And that would actually reduce emissions by about 4 to 8 million tons of CO2 a year. But of course, there'd be a delayed response. We wouldn't get anything till 2050, because when you plant trees, it depends on where you're planting them and what you're planting and what was there before. But usually if you plant them, it takes about 10 to 20 years before you start getting sort of sequestration, a net sequestering sinking carbon over the release of carbon. So it's not instant, it's the long game. There's nothing wrong with being in the long game, but it's not going to help us to 2030. It could in the long term, and it's also a way of engaging people. So you might have noticed that there's already been a call out for the first call of this 2 billion trees program, and I think the second call is at the end of May. So it's worth looking at that, seeing. I had suggested maybe if the whole Capital Regional District got together, I talked to Dave Howe about that, maybe we could get in on this program. I know Hornby Island had a plant 5,000 trees program, which they did and completed last year. They had trouble finding enough places on their island to plant those 5,000 trees. So we were lucky they planted some on our island because we really need them, but probably your island needs them too. The other thing I looked at was the restoration of salt marshes. And again, this is kind of a bit difficult to quantify, but there is one study that looked at, we just restored 20% of the salt marshes in just the Bay of Fundy. We could sequester an additional about 3.5 million tons of CO2 per year. And that would, and that doesn't really talk about the storage and what we lose every time we destroy a wetland or an eelgrass bed. And I just put this in here because it's so local, and it just shows you how much eelgrass, for example, we've lost in the Salish Sea area over the years. The one on the left shows that we've lost about 40% of the cover, the area cover of eelgrass beds, but then what we have left is 70% fragmented. So we have a lot of potential restoration work, and some of that is happening right here in the Salish Sea, and that's pretty exciting. But I think we should start counting the carbon in that. And then my fifth recommendation related to financial resources, because even though we've now committed approximately $3.9 billion to nature-based climate solutions in Canada, and that's a first step and kind of exciting, a lot of people recognize, compared to the kinds of investments we make in the fossil fuel industry and some other solutions, it's really very small. So the potential for greenhouse gas emissions from my first recommendation, as I said, was quite high. And this investment is a first step. But if you think, for example, that Canada's committed way over $3 billion to carbon capture and storage technology, and that was 10 years ago, and so much more has been committed since. And it's a technology that's unproven. And even though the IPCC talks about it, its potential is a fraction of what the potential of nature-based solutions is. So we need to fund this kind of work appropriately. So it's a third of the emission reductions and receives less than 3% of the climate financing. So that's pretty big. I did leave another question period, but I think I'm going to skip that question period and leave it to the next section. So in the next section, I talk a little bit about accounting matters. And just to let you know, like, numbers are really confusing in this whole field because of some of the questions people have asked before, because of the way we count. So this graph shows you just a little bit about what's in Canada's greenhouse gas inventory on forest removals and emissions. And greenhouse gas emissions, that one in the red, I told you this is 2018 data, the most recent data, 729 million tons of CO2 equivalents were released in Canada in 2018. The forests removed they absorbed about 140 million tons, and they emitted about 126 million tons. So that's from forestry and all the emissions that happen when you do that, all the and the losing sequestration, et cetera. So the net sequestration, according to Canada's emissions inventory, was 14 million tons in 2018. And they predicted if everything went as is, that number would go down by 2030 to about 10 million tons. But many people have questioned these numbers. And I'm not an expert in forest accounting, although I've certainly been in a lot of discussions and looked at a lot of data. But there's another way of looking at this. So this is a graph that was done by, I don't know if any of you read Barry Saxifrage. I think he's really clever at looking at the same numbers. He just looks at the inventory, and he's come to the conclusion that if you really look at the managed forests, that the CO2 emitted by harvested wood far exceeds what the forests are absorbing. So our forests are no longer a sink, but they're a source, and that's because we're logging too much. You can read his papers and believe it or not, but he is using the same data, looking at it with a different viewpoint. This is this graph looks at accounting for deforestation. So in the Canadian inventory, we say that we deforest very little. It's just a small percentage of our total managed, and we only talk about managed forest area. But a study was done in Ontario that looked at what's the impact of logging scars and seismic lines. And these pictures show you, the one on the top shows you just, areas where there's been roads for logging and places to store logs and all the different activities around logging. And they looked at this, and 20 years later, this never comes back. So this isn't considered deforestation because there's still forests there and growing, but it is deforestation because the forests never come back onto that land. And this study has not been done in British Columbia, but it was done by the Wildlands League, and they would love to do it in British Columbia because they think they'd find the same in British Columbia, maybe even worse. So they found that by 2030, these logging scars are equivalent to about 41 million tons of CO2 in foregone carbon removals. This is just the sinks, and that's far more than the sink that the 15 million tons that our inventory says our forests are. So in fact, we do have deforestation, but we don't count this kind of deforestation. And deforestation is usually defined as, a different land use. If you're cutting a forest down and you're putting a forest back there, that's not deforestation. But in this sense, can this not be considered deforestation because you're never getting a forest back there? And then I get into this thing about green energy or greenwashing. So you've heard a lot. You've heard the Premier in British Columbia announce that we're getting into the wood pellet business in a big way. It's a burgeoning industry in British Columbia. It's grown at the rate of 11.6% annually, with most of the pellet production going from Europe and North America. most of this pellet production is coming from Europe and North America. That's a sort of annual growth rate. In Canada, pellet production has been growing at 12% a year. And with 2,900 million tons in 2019, that's how much pellets we sent off to the UK and Japan. And originally, the IPCC had said if you use wood pellets, you burn wood pellets in a, say, coal-fired plant, which is what they're doing in the UK, then that's carbon neutral, because eventually those trees will grow back. But everybody who's looked at this analysis has shown it's not carbon neutral. It can take anywhere from 150 to 400 years to recover the carbon debt from harvesting those trees. Now, in British Columbia, we were told, oh, well, we're not harvesting trees for this. We're only taking the slash burn that's left behind. But that is not true. This picture at the top shows you a pellet factory in BC, where there's just a bunch of whole logs lined up. And the reason for that is partly because, can you imagine the expense of going to every slash burn, picking up the slash burns, taking them to a wood pellet factory? That's just not economical. And the one on the left, the bottom left, that picture is an interior old growth. These are very unique interior rainforests, primary forests, and they have tags on them now to be logged by the pellet industry. So really, it's a little bit disingenuous to say that it's zero emissions. It's very disingenuous. And also to say that we're not logging for the pellet industry is also disingenuous. So I put that out there for the numbers and what we count and what we don't count. I'm not going to get to this too much. I talked to this a little bit, but I have some different numbers from the Canadian Forest Service, and I really looked at why that is. And part of it has to do with, this graph on the very left, I have sinks from CFS, and it's so small, but you can see that they have that if you were to have a moratorium on the harvest of old growth, BC's old growth forests, this is only a study on BC, that in fact, it would result in more emissions. And that's, as I told you, because they are assuming that you have to increase the logging area, but I'm saying you can't do that. That's leakage. You have to not increase, you have to log less. You can't go and protect the old growth forest and then log more somewhere else. And so that's part of why my numbers are different. And the other reason is because I also look at stores, and they don't in that study look at stores at all. They also looked at biofuels, and they only assumed that all the wood pellets were being used in British Columbia, so they didn't have to look at transportation elsewhere, and that only slash burns were being harvested. And in fact, we're the biggest exporter in Canada of wood pellets in British Columbia, so that's just not honest. That's just a little bit of the same. And so I could stop there, but if I just have a few minutes, I've been going on for too long, just let me introduce you to carbon offsets, just very, very briefly. And maybe at some time we can have a dialogue on carbon offsets. There's three really kind of offsets. There's what's in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. That's the only article that hasn't been approved by countries yet. It's called Internationally Transferred Mitigation Outcomes. This has got to do with the rules for countries to reach their nationally determined contributions through trading with other countries. So say Canada can't reach its emissions, then they could buy emissions reductions from, say, the Congo for protecting their peat forests. And Canada has not said we're going to do this. We don't even have the rules. It's so hotly contested. Some of the things that are hotly contested are relate to human rights, Indigenous rights, and what they call ecological integrity, which means what the atmosphere actually sees. And some countries don't want it to be what the atmosphere sees. They want a different trading mechanism. And so that gets into double counting, this issues of if Canada were to buy some emissions from the Congo, should they be able to count those emissions as well as us? Obviously not, because that's double counting. So it's a very complex issue, Article 6. Canada's kind of on the side of the angels in this in the discussions at least. Then there's another kind of offsets that's called the national regulatory market. Canada is developing a national regulatory market, and they've developed the federal greenhouse gas offset credit system. And the purpose of this is to encourage reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in industrial sectors that are not regulated by carbon pricing. I think that's wrong. It's that are regulated by carbon pricing, and to encourage going beyond requirements. And so the idea is that if it's cheaper for, say, a fossil fuel plant to plant, 1,000 hectares of trees in a sort of destroyed forest from, I don't know, spruce budworm or the mountain pine beetle, then they could do that, and that would be considered an offset, offsetting what they're required to do through the government regulations. And right now they've got some priority projects that are out for review, and somewhere in May is the review deadline, and they have priority projects and improved forest management and enhanced soil organic carbon, which is really an agriculture project, are in there, nature-based solutions. So you could look at those and comment on them. And then there's the voluntary offset market, which most people are interested in. That's encouraging the voluntary reduction in greenhouse gas emissions for anybody that go beyond regulations and are not required. So if you want to offset your air travel, for example, or something like that. And this is something that is being used right here in British Columbia. In the Great Bear Rainforest, for example, 37 million tons of carbon offsets were sold since 2019. And that created $43 million for First Nation communities to steward their lands and also to find economic activities that did not result in the release of carbon. And those in the Great Bear Rainforest, there's been some, they say that they have a future inventory of another 16.5 million tons that they could sell. And the British Columbia government has met its targets for greenhouse gas emissions by buying offsets from the Great Bear Rainforest. So that's been a big project, and it's controversial, and the Auditor General is saying it's not legitimate. Other people think it is legitimate. And so I'm not going to tell you whether I think it's legitimate or not, but it's just something to think about. All these carbon offset programs have to be verified. You have to show you really have the emission reductions, that it's an activity that wouldn't have happened otherwise, and that and usually that it has some co-benefit for biodiversity. Another project right in British Columbia is the Darkwoods Conservation Area. This is 670 kilometers squared of private conservation area by the Nature Conservancy of Canada. And they raised $4 million to save 7,000 tons of carbon credits to buy the land. And they consider this quite legitimate. And since then, the British Columbia government has contributed to expanding this area. And that's because it was an area that would have been logged, and they have this verified. So it's I don't know, it's controversial because should you not just have to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions directly? Is this a sort of way out that doesn't really help? Is it legitimate? I heard somebody in, it was a narwhal discussion on nature-based solutions, and somebody, moderator, said that they thought that the NCC carbon credit program was not legitimate, although it is verified. And it's really been a savior for conservation. So I don't know what I want to say about it, but it's something to think about, and there's pros and cons to both of them. I'm organizing a forum just on this, the pros and the cons, at the World Conservation Congress, which is coming up in September, which I hope will be virtual. And then just I'm ending now. My take-home messages, I don't think I'll read them, but I think you've got the message that I think there's the potential for Canada to increase its ambitions if it adheres to a strict set of principles, and it could increase its protection arsenal by really looking at the carbon dense, high biodiversity areas. And don't forget about coastal restoration and pro-forestation. We need to improve our accounting. We need to be more transparent, and we need to account for all our ecosystems, not just our forests, although forests are important. And we need to account for natural disturbances. Somebody raised that question, which we don't really. And we need to really account for the old growth forests, the little that we have left on productive land. And also consider all types of deforestation, and then that offsets are controversial. So that is the end.